For joining. And I was gonna start off with the Grunfeld tonight. Yeah, sounds good. Let's take a look at that. I was gonna open up an analysis board. Thank you very much for joining. Yeah, no worries. No, welcome, welcome, Ahmet. You are. I don't think you're playing. I don't think I have a game for you tonight, but we can take a look at the Grunfeld, and hopefully this will be instructive. So yeah, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, and here I guess I would say you know, basically you know, this is the Queen's Gambit declined, 3 knights variation, and yeah, it looks. I mean, basically, I was interested in going into some Grunfeld theory, but I figured I would go into the standard Queen's Gambit decline to show some differences. You know, basically, the Grunfeld involves the knight taking on d5. You know, this is sort of done out of necessity and sort of done out of, you know, just the way that opening is normally played. But like here, you know, if the pawn takes d5, you would take with the pawn. So I guess that implies that, you know, in the standard Queen's Gambit, and maybe this is, you know, maybe this is obvious, but if pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, bishop g7. In this particular case, this basically, you know, this idea would be to, you know, basically move the knight to d5, and then knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and yeah, white has a huge center. But yeah, you know, basically here, you know, white gets center control, and then black gets better piece play. Black attacks with c5, and then there ends up being basically, you know, kind of a struggle where black is attacking on the queen side, and white is basically attacking on the and white is basically attacking using the center. There's definitely some breaks in the Grunfeld where you get d5, e5, and basically these, you know, after c5, which is the normal move. So say here, you know, bishop to c4. Here the move is c5. This is the main line. And here, you know, in the long run, d5 can be played, e5 can be played, and pressure can be applied on, you know, the d6 pawn. What if d takes c5? Well, in this case, you know, early bishop takes c3. This sacrifices a, you know, this sacrifices basically a pawn, and wins in exchange for black. I guess it just wins in exchange. Here, bishop to d2, bishop takes, queen takes, and white basically has control of, you know, the center here, or black has control of the center here. It's a material advantage, and black is okay. Hey, yeah, not much. I don't know. I'm having a weird day. I had something that reminded me so much of my old job, and I was just like, screw that. But sorry, sorry to. I'm having a weird day, and I have to think about it. No, I'm here. Yeah. No. It's funny. I worked in finance for a number of years in New York, and you know, it really made me think. I feel like I've gone soft, you know, to be completely honest. I guess I must be. I must really be out of practice or something. Anyways, thinking about that. But no, it's fine. It's fine. It's just reminiscent of something that I don't do anymore. So anyways, I made a decision that I think I'm going to make differently, but I tie it very much to having gone soft. So I'm going to have to think about that a little bit. Anyways, not a this is a free chess lesson stream, and we'll keep it that. But yeah, having a weird day. Anyways, g6, knight c3, d5, pawn takes, knight takes, e4, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, pawn g7, and basically here, you know, I think this is sort of better for black. You know, it's a very good, efficient response for black. But yeah, knight f3, bishop c4, c5, and basically black will place pressure on you know, the center here. Here I think bishop to c4 is probably the best strategy. Let's take a look at the opening book. Knight f3, bishop c4, bishop e3, and then c5 is the response. But here, I guess I would say knight to f3, you know, you see frequently. Bishop c4 I think of as the main line, but I guess this is the second most common. c5 here, and you're basically in the main line Grunfeld. No, it's just funny. It's funny. It cracks me up. Sort of, to be completely honest, sort of the type of thing that I left finance to avoid, but still, man, I just got to think about that one. I guess, you know, life just sucks at the end of the day. But I'm trying to run this. I'm trying to run this chess lesson, so I'll just stop. Get it off this. Yeah. Some days, man. Some days. Anyways, so c5 puts pressure on d4. You know, if the d4 is moved, if d4 gets moved, then bishop takes c3. But yeah, I don't know. Here I would say probably knight to e2. This sort of just continues on. Castles here. Knight c6 was also playable. Castles, knight c6, and basically here I would take a look at pawn takes. You know, I guess I would take a look here with the pin gone. Pawn takes c5 has more appeal for black. I usually see bishop e3 strengthening the center here, and here I play knight a5. Knight a5, bishop d3, c4. You know, I've never really had any issues with this. Basically, this ends up you know, placing pressure on the center, or basically this ends up putting pressure on this flank. White has a better center here, and anyways, I think ideas like b5 could be helpful, a6 could be helpful, and bishop to g4 could be helpful. But anyways, yeah, I guess black, you know, black basically just has a general advancement here on the queen side. Spassky variation. I wonder if this is a Fischer-Spassky thing. No, I mean not that, not really, but it's just kind of crazy when yeah. Anyways, whatever. Queen a4. I'd say castles here probably, but knight e2 seems to provide a pretty good response for white. Other lines, you know, I think one important line in the Grunfeld is this anti-Grunfeld line, f3. Here d5, pawn takes, knight takes, e4. Knight goes to b6 here. Basically, you know, this ends up providing a lot of benefits for white. In terms of eval, it's still, you know, roughly about the same. But this, you know, basically having this pawn on f3 as opposed to having this pawn on c3, I think basically ends up providing more of a solid center for white. The f3 is compromised because this knight is basically this knight is blocked from its you know, most primary square here, but bishop g7 I think yeah. Nah, what can you do? But yeah, I'd look at bishop knight b6 and then knight c3, bishop g7 and bishop e3, castles, queen d2, and knight c6. Castles, queen d6, knight b5, queen d7, and you're basically in a situation. It's a little bit unusual to see white castling queenside in any kind of Grunfeld opening. But here, yeah, I guess I would say this this general line is better to it's better to take a look at threats of knight takes d4 as opposed to castling queenside. Knight b5, knight b4 is a move that black could use to try to advance this attack. Thinking maybe a5, knight b4, and then ultimately black will have a reasonably good attack on the queen side. Let's see. Here it's about equal. I think that's probably about right. This white development is weak on the king side. I think you can play like a6, rook d8, and then threats on d4. Yeah, in general, I guess I would say this ends up playing out pretty strong for white against black. Again, black against white. Basically, this you don't think a 1300 can play this? Maybe. It's complicated. I guess I would say here, the Grunfeld leads to a few different lines. Here, we have a few different options. Knight f3 is a Grunfeld without knight c3. Here, d5 is no longer the most popular. You usually play bishop g7, wait for knight c3 on the next move. Here, g3, bishop g7, and then d5 is coming. Knight c3, d5, knight f3, castles, c takes, bishop g2, and either knight takes c3. I'd probably play c6 here. You can also sort of transpose it by playing c5. Castles, knight takes c3, b takes c3, knight c6, and basically this castling, or basically this opening situation ends up being better for white against black. This offers less opportunity, I think. I mean, basically, you're playing something along the lines of like bishop e6, bishop c4 potentially. I think of bishop g2 as a line that's I guess less challenging to black, but overall relatively close to equality. So g6, knight c3, d5, pawn takes, knight takes, e4, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and overall this ends up being better for black. Basically better for black, or better for black relative to some d4 openings. This challenges the white side more effectively. So I think bishop g7, c5 is probably the way to go. And c5 is a good response after bishop g7. Bishop g7 pushing c5 is, I think, better for black. Bishop c4, castles, either knight to c6 or c5, but this is basically well-explored theory. Knight e2, c5, castles, knight c6, bishop e3, queen c7. And now, I think black basically is just going to try to put pressure on the c3 pawn, going to put pressure on the c4 bishop, and then moves like e6 can be played. Knight a5 here probably is the best idea for black, but there's a few different ways forward, and white has the initiative, but overall, this provides a challenging play on the center for black. Basically, in situations where very symmetrical Queen's Gambit decline type games, black doesn't really have much chance. I mean, his goals are basically to play solidly and maneuver into a queenside win. Here, there's a lot of asymmetry, a lot of chances. D takes c5 here, yeah. This basically is, I think this is pretty good. Knight e5 can be played. Maybe the bishop plays to b3, and probably e6 or bishop to d7 could be good for black. But I would look at like knight to g4. This looks strong. This puts some threats on the board, and maybe bishop f4 here, I guess. Bishop f4, queen takes c5. But let's go back. This is a situation in which pawn takes c5 begins to become acceptable. Overall, I think moves like knight to e5, knight to a5 are probably the best ideas for black. But anyways, I think black has created a situation with asymmetry and a lot of chances, and that's sort of what you're going for in the Grunfeld. We're just sort of scratching the surface here, but this is an example of a few mainline Grunfelds and an f3 Grunfeld. As black, you play them pretty similarly. You play the knight takes d5, bishop g7, c5, and then take c3 in this case. But if the c3 pawn is defended, then don't take it, obviously. But yeah, overall, I think black is basically black is basically okay. Black's okay. He's created a situation that doesn't resemble the general closed d4 openings that white was hoping for. I think overall it's a good position. So yeah, interesting. Let's take a look at the first game up is Jack Silver, so let's do that one. Okay, so Jack Silver's game. Jack Silver is playing this, and yeah, e5, c5. This is a line in the French. Basically, it's basically a way that the Caro-Kann can transpose into the French. This is a very common opening, lots well-known theory. I'm surprised that d takes c5 is the most common here, though. Basically in the French, I would not play d takes c5 here. I would play c3. As I've said a few times on the stream, this d4 e5 this d4 e5 structure is the one that's the most helpful for white. And here, basically on pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, white has eliminated one of the key issues in his position in the French. Here, like knight f3, bishop f4, bishop e2, these are the types of moves that I think are the most beneficial for white. Here, I think d takes c5 will lead to this kind of compromised French structure, where both the e5 pawn is weak and the c5 pawn is weak, and you basically have to try to hold on to both of them. Hard to do. c3, f4, pawn takes, and then here, king takes, and basically white's in pretty good shape. Black's in pretty good shape. The issues in terms of this opening, I like the way that this is playing out for white. I'm surprised that the eval is so not generous. I guess knight to b4 is kind of a problem with rook to c2. But a3 I think is probably the best play. e6 is sort of, I don't know. I feel like this is somewhat passive. I would have played knight to b4. But yeah, sorry, I just realized we're playing from black's perspective. This makes sense. So c3 as opposed to pawn takes c5, I think is better for white. But now basically black is playing some form of the Caro-Kann, different than the French because the bishop is on f5. I think there's tactical threats along the lines of like knight to b4. I don't know if you play those immediately. You might want to play e6, bishop e7, knight to h6. But yeah, that would be my suggestion here. e6, bishop e4, bishop e2, and then black has sort of almost a one pawn advantage here. Bishop e4, and here white is sort of neutralized black's advantage. Where was the error here? Knight b4, I guess, no longer offers much. Basically, knight b4 is sort of weak when, knight b4 is basically sort of weak when you are aiming to, create threats along the c file. It's strong when the king is on e1 and you can play knight c2 forking, but here, I don't really think you've got much. Maybe AR c8. But overall, I think, probably knight to b4 is a reasonable strategy. It's a reasonable strategy, but not as strong as if the king was still on e1. Here, the rook's going to move to e1 or c1, and knight f2 doesn't carry much weight. It's basically threatening the rook and the bishop on e3, basically. Yeah, black ends up winning tactically here. So in terms of improvements for black, where would I have changed this game if I was playing black here? The ideas, I guess I would say, c5, f4, pawn takes, queen b6, b3. This all makes sense to me. This pawn structure in the center is sort of weak. This d4 pawn is isolated. But yeah, I guess I would play knight to b4 here, and basically be better as black. Maybe e6. But knight to b4 seems to threaten a fork of the king and the rook on a1. So yeah, knight b4 is probably the best idea with the king still on e1. Afterwards, I think knight b4 is an error. I think basically, like here, knight b4 doesn't really provide great attacking chances. It can be dealt with too easily, like just hrc1, rook hc1, and rook challenging it. I'm sort of impressed by the eval shift here. I want to make sure that I fully understand this one. I guess, basically white needs to prevent knight to c2. Bishop to d1 or knight to e1 is probably the most effective way to do it. The issue with a defended knight on c2 is it makes this rook open to a discovered check from the bishop on e4. So here, knight c2, rook takes, king e1, and I think basically black is fine. Black is winning material and up. So, anyways, I guess here. What are the advantages? How does black improve? I'm surprised that the eval is so good here. Looking for a black misstep. I think queen b4 is probably not the right play. I think, you've basically created a situation where you can create a lot of pressure with knight to b4. This forces, white to deal with your threat on c2. Maybe here knight to a3 could be good. But generally, I think black is better. Yeah, knight to b4 I think is the right idea. So yeah, so in terms of looking at this game, where are the improvements for black? Queen d2 is probably an error. I think maybe the engine is suggesting king f2. That looks crazy. I don't know. Maybe knight to d2. But overall, yeah, queen to d2 I guess makes sense. I guess bishop to d4 is completely or bishop to d2 is unplayable. So queen to d2 is probably the best idea. Here, e6 might be the best idea for black. Here, you're waiting for the queen to take your queen, and then you can advance with check. But here, I guess I would just say black is reasonably solid, not much of an advantage, and I think maybe knight to b4 is a better way to go. Okay, so I think black's been pretty reasonable. Bishop f5, pawn takes, b3, queen b4. And here, what are white's moves? Like a3 preventing bishop b4 or knight b4. That makes sense. Rook to c1, I guess, maybe. Certainly by this fork, things are going pretty badly for white. I guess a3 would have been an improvement, but since Jack was playing black, maybe, I don't know. Castles is probably slightly inefficient. You could probably try knight to f5. Knight to f5 threatens this bishop, and then potentially, on the taking of the bishop, if you have the knight on b4, you could threaten with knight to c2. So like knight f5, rook hc1, knight c2, and then moving basically the bishop has to move, otherwise the fork's coming. Knight takes e3, knight to c2, and basically black is looking pretty solid. So where do you advance here? I would play knight to b4. I don't know. Knight to h6 is getting suggested. Probably wouldn't do that. E6 makes sense. Queen to b4 I think is somewhat unchallenging. I think you want to play e6, bishop to b4. I know this isn't the engine line. The engine line is knight h6, but e6, with followed up with bishop b4 and queen a5, I think that might provide a better option for black. Bishop f5, pawn takes, queen b6, b3, queen b4. Yeah, I mean, I guess e6 here and then bishop to b4. That works. Queen to b4 is just sort of a slow moving move. It's trading off here doesn't really make a lot of sense since you're the attacker. Go with e6, bishop b4, and pressure on d2. That would probably be my best strategy. Queen b4, queen takes, knight there. This overall, looks like black is slightly better, has slightly better initiative, but I am sort of left wondering if there were solid improvements for black. E6, knight f3, bishop b4, bishop b2. Yep, this looks best for black, I think. Moves like bishop to, or on knight h4, I guess I would play probably bishop to, I don't know, bishop to c3. That's bishop to c3, threatens to win this rook. Probably has pretty good chances of winning this rook. Rook to c1, bishop b2, rook to d1 maybe, or rook to c5. You really can dislocate that rook with threats from the bishop. I think bishop e2 is an error. Probably wants to play. I mean, the engine is suggesting king f2. So yeah, but I mean, as we're sort of closing out, it's an interesting game. As we're sort of closing out on this analysis, I'm thinking about tangible ways to improve. Pawn takes, e4 or d4 is a great tactic. I definitely want to give credit to this. This closes the game out. But where would I have changed the game as black? This all looks fine. Queen to b4 doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. I think you should go with better developing moves. The engine is suggesting knight a6. E6 is e6 and then bishop to b4 probably makes a lot of sense. Here bishop takes, king takes, knight f2, knight to b4, and black is back to equality. There's no reason to get this position back to equality. I wouldn't have traded the queen. I would have continued to develop. Ideas here: knight e7. Okay. And here, I don't know. I guess knight f5, but it's sort of tricky because moving. You want to maintain your development too. I guess castling doesn't directly help that much. It's probably better to just start attacking here. Knight to b4, threatening the c2 square. Maybe you should play king to d7. I'm wondering if king to d7 is playable or whether bishop to b5 just sort of refutes that as a potential castling square. Probably is just better to castle. So I would take a look at queen b4. I think that's probably not what you want to do in the midst of an attack. When you're attacking, you want to keep the pieces on the board. Here, I think this basically ends up pretty well for black. If the game ends here and you play relatively conservative moves, black's up significant compensation. Bishop b4, bishop c3 looks good. Knight to b4, threatening to go to b2 looks good. But straightforward development. If you can bring these pieces into the game to help solidify your attack, that seems like a good plan. White needs to do something to prevent knight c2, and he doesn't do that. After knight e3, this rook is in trouble. Rook a2, knight takes e3, rook takes c8. But I think basically black does a pretty good job of capitalizing on this. The position's bad for white, and black manages to exploit the weaknesses in the position. So bishop takes, g4, knight b4, knight c2, rook takes. Black's better. The real chance so I don't think knight b4 was necessarily that great an idea. I think probably playing like rook to c8 is a better idea. But anything to face off against rook c1. The knight to c2 is a great move and completely justified if you're actually getting knight c2 in. That justifies knight b4. But white doesn't have to let this happen. He could play knight e1 here, and basically this threat is no longer an effective one. White's showing a plus 0.5 here, and that's good. So I would steer away from knight b4. I recognize that gave you a good advantage in this game after knight c2, but there's no reason that white needed to allow that to happen. I sort of like attacks involving a5, a5 and a4, a5, a3, a4. This looks pretty good for white, but generally I think after b4. It's close to equality, but that's good for white considering that white was down in terms of eval before. Interesting game. So I guess I would say in terms of things to change around, it worked well for you. You won the game, which is great. Queen b4, queen takes is probably not the right idea. Engine is suggesting knight h6. I would suggest e6 and bishop to b4 instead of trading off the queens. You're just starting an attack, so there's no reason to simplify. It doesn't really make a ton of sense. Knight b4 here is also playable. It's difficult for white to respond to that forking threat on knight c2. So I wouldn't have done that. I would have played probably... Actually, after looking at knight b4, I'm really tempted to play that. I think that might, I think that forces knight a3, which is a really awkward move. So I would probably go with that. Here, black's looking good. This all sort of makes intuitive sense. And then here, I think knight b4 is just an overextension. The most positional moves are things like a6, b5, or a5, a4. This knight to b4 move basically leads to overextension if white plays correctly. There's just no way to continue to run this attack. So I guess I would side against knight to b4. I think the attack ended up working great, so maybe you know your opponents better than I know your opponents, but a5, a4 seems like a more drawn-out positional attack that offers black better possibilities given best play. So I would steer away from knight to b4 too. I think it's just a little bit superficial. It worked great, but superficial at this point in the game. Interesting game. Thank you for sending it, Jack. On to the next one. This is SWWI versus Hanadog. Cool. This is interesting. This is Alapin with immediate d5. I always think this is good, and because basically one of the pushes that black needs, one of the things that the black needs in the Sicilian is d5. With d5 here, I think with d5 here, basically, I think black is challenging. I think basically black is almost close to equality. This really steers things towards black's center control. With e5, this is complete equality. This transposes into something that looks like the French with black moves ahead, or Caro-Kann with black several moves ahead in terms of tempo. So bishop f5 here, and I think you're in an equal position. Pawn takes d5 is a little bit more complicated. Pawn takes d5 is going to give black center control in an asymmetrical position with the queen taking d5. Ideas like, I don't know, knight a3, bishop c4, and I don't know. Basically, this queen can't easily be challenged here. c4 is not really a great idea. Knight a3, bishop c4 is not really a great idea. So the queen's sort of left just attacking in general in the center. Overall, this is good. Ideas are like knight f3, d4, knight a3, things like that for white I think are pretty good. But yeah, that with either of those, I think white is no worse than equal. Queen e2, knight c6, pawn takes, knight c6, and basically black is good. I guess I would say, knight a3 is probably pretty strong, or pretty good for white, but black's development leads by enough that that white's going to be kind of struggling for equality. Um, it's just a good way to play against the Sicilian Alapin, in my opinion. And after Queen E2, which is not the best move for white, the best moves for white are the best move for white is pawn takes D5, pawn takes D5, knight F3. Then white is in a pretty good position. I guess I would say pawn takes D5, queen takes D5, and then maybe D4. But yeah, overall good for white, or good for black after Queen E2. Knight f3, knight f6, queen takes, knight takes d5, and here white has an isolated queen pawn, and maybe knight a3 is the best idea, but this is worse for white. I mean, basically you've given black you've given black a better pawn structure, 3 pawn islands versus 2. And you've given black, potential to play knight c2, and you've given black a developmental advantage. So here, I guess I would say, bishop to b5 is probably pretty good, knight a3. But yeah, bishop c3, bishop d5, bishop d3. Overall, black looks solid. White's going to try to make attempts with advancing his pieces here. But yeah, overall, I guess I would say this is about equal. Castles, rook d1, and here, basically, white has, it's equalized. So this is actually a series of moves that goes pretty well for white. When you're looking at this situation, I think a5 is, I guess a5 is an error. Maybe knight to e3 could be good. But a5 is not the best. I would continue on with normal development. A5, I guess the idea is to post knight b4, but that's not really particularly good either. I mean, if you play knight b4, there's going to be trading, and eventually black's going to end up with doubled isolated pawns on the b file. So, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop b5, and overall white sort of equalizes. Inefficiencies on a5 and inefficiencies on, I guess mostly just a5. It was a good opportunity to continue to develop, and black instead plays a5 for a speculative attack that isn't really that powerful. King e6 evaluated as brilliant. That's pretty aggressive. That's a pretty aggressive interpretation. Here, bishop takes e3. Okay. Sorry, g5 is a missed win. Bishop e3 was better. Interesting. So let's count this out. This makes sense. So bishop takes is obviously forced, right? Because anything besides king takes, anything besides bishop takes, and the king's going to go to g5. And the king's going to go to e4, and basically, basically if the bishop moves here, the bishop's just going to take the b6 pawn uncompensated. So trading bishops is pretty important for black versus white here. Here, I don't know, probably bishop d8. It looks like about equality. But where do I think that white should be improving? So I really like this d5 response to the Sicilian Alapin. If you're given the opportunity to play d5 in the Sicilian, you probably should. Pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, and all of this I think ends up being pretty good for black. Knight takes d5, and maybe knight a3 here. But overall, I think white's playing from behind now. This development is good for black. Queen takes, knight a3, good. Maybe bishop d2. But overall here, you're pretty close to equality. I really want to try to isolate some errors because these games seem pretty accurate to me. Yeah, this is a 94 to 93. I mean, it's a good game. Where are their changes? Yeah, I mean, both sides are really playing pretty well, so it's hard for me to pick out things to improve. I don't know how white let this slip away. I mean, basically, Sicilian Alapin is probably a pretty good opening for white. Or I mean, Sicilian Alapin is probably a pretty playable opening for white. So with moves like Queen d5, the Sicilian Alapin is not as is not as strong as basically with Queen d5. Sicilian Alapin with Queen e2 is just not very good for white. Pawn takes d5, and this is a playable opening. Queen takes d5. Basically, you're at eval of like plus 0.5. But yeah, I'm thinking like d4 is good. Knight f3 is good. But overall, white's gonna be, white's gonna sort of be in relatively good shape. There's no developmental disadvantage. Queen e2 is a non-developing move, and it sort of blocks off this bishop's development and potentially this knight's development. So black's already showing a big positive after Queen e2. Pretty much anything is going to be good for black. Black now has this developmental advantage. This knight got out while white was busy moving his queen. So ideas like d3 could be good. Queen c4. But by this point, basically, this developmental advantage has gotten white a solid lead, or sorry, black a solid lead. There's not much that white can really do. Pawn takes, knight b4, and yeah, here basically white is just worse. I mean, this pawn structure is much better for black. Black was able to turn his developmental advantage into an improvement in pawn structure. With d4 here, knight takes d4 is better, but if you just trade off the knights, you end up with an isolated queen pawn. White's pawn structure is worse, white's development is worse. Here it's more equalized, but white's pawn structure is still worse. With knight e3, this traps the bishop and wrecks black's pawn structure to make it symmetrical. Bishop to g7, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop to b5, and now we're pretty close to equality. White securing the symmetry in the pawn structure is a good idea. So I don't know. Maybe king f3 here, but overall, I think white's basically capitalizing with bishop to e3 here. He forces a trade, earlier. So on e5, bishop e3 basically allows white to force off this bishop. When the bishop takes e3, king takes e3, king g5, and then king goes back and takes the pawn, and then ends up taking the b pawn and moving to a7 and queening the pawn. So yeah, so solid. Solid makes sense, and basically accurate play through the endgame. The worst move, in my opinion, is probably this queen e2 move. I think you just can't do it in this opening. It's not even on the list of potential opening opportunities. Pawn takes, queen d5, and white is just sort of worse. This development is just better for black. Clean, good. Black's up a solid half a pawn. I don't know if d4 was a good idea. I think d4 probably wasn't a good idea. Here, you have your pawns covering all the dark squares. I'd probably play like bishop to b5. I think this is the best idea for white. And with bishop to b5, the knight is pinned on c6, and white's getting straightforward development to black to match black's development. So knight e3 was a good tactic. So in terms of moves that I think white could have improved upon, queen e2 is definitely one of them. Pawn takes d5 is objectively the best opening move there. And then I wouldn't have played d4. You don't need to capture the center, with a pawn here. Trading your d pawn so that you end up with an isolated queen's pawn is just not good for white. You should probably play bishop b5 with castling in mind. You could probably play bishop to e2, or even knight to a3 looks kind of interesting. But something that develops as opposed to just basically it ends up basically harming your pawn structure. Pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes, pawn takes. White's pawn structure is worse. In a game that's relatively symmetrical, except for black having better minor pieces, you should just try to improve your minor pieces, castle, and you'll be in good shape. Bishop b5, I think, is the move. So yeah, on to the next game. This one is Abdu009 versus Goxel. Okay. Yeah. So the two moves in that last game, just for memory, are Queen e2 is not the correct move in that opening. It's not in the opening book. I understand it because you're waiting for pawn takes e4 and then queen takes e4, but it's just not solid. It doesn't provide the development that you need. The other idea, I guess I would say, is that d4 seems premature. Okay, d4, knight c3 I think is not correct in just there are openings that go knight c3, but it's not a preferred move. It's well down the list. The issue with this knight c3, knight c6, I mean, it's interesting that black played symmetrically, is one of the main things in the Queen's Gambit declined and the symmetrical Queen's Pawn game is where you play c4. You need something to challenge a break on d5 with. I don't know whether that's e4, I don't know whether that's knight f3, but yeah, I guess I would say, when you play knight c3, knight c6, you're probably going for something, you're not exerting the appropriate amount of pressure on the d5 square. E4, knight takes, knight f5. Yeah, this is all pretty good for white, I think. And I think black's just better here. You should probably just... so I would steer white away from knight to c3. Knight to c3 blocks in the c-pawn, that's not good. E4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, hangs the d4 pawn. Hanging that pawn is not good either. So e4 is not playable. It has to be ordered knight f3 and then e4. This is why a break with c4 is often the preferred idea in the Queen's Gambit or Queen's Pawn games. Knight takes f5, bishop e3, and here black's showing a good position. I mean, black didn't basically ended up winning the d pawn for no compensation, and white's good. Bishop to g5 is an idea, and this is pretty brutal. This attack evolved very quickly. Let's just take a look at the miniature here. White should not have hung the d4 pawn. I think black's playing relatively reasonably. Here I would play c6 and then prepare to move the knight to d7. But yeah, both sides sort of mishandle their c-pawns here. On e4 you can play pawn takes d4, and then I would say queen takes d4 here. But you play f5 instead. Here you can play knight c3, but the d4 pawn is still hanging. So, even though the eval is still positive, white lost a pawn here. The response here is bishop to e5, but even then, that's sort of, I guess, with bishop e5, either I would say c5 is probably the best move, but with a knight move like knight d8 or knight d6 or knight c6, the queen takes on d8 and then the knight takes on d8, and the bishop is threatening on c7. So, what are the options? This gets pretty aggressive for black. Were there better opportunities for white here? I don't know if there were that many. It definitely didn't have to lead to mate, but white's position is not good. Black has this outpost that's very solid, this knight on d4. You probably do have things like bishop e5, knight takes e2, something like that. But bishop to g5 doesn't really solve any problems related to the knight on d4. Bishop e7, castles, knight g3. And overall here, this is obviously a big error. But bishop g2 would work fine. The mate needs to be prevented. Bishop g2 does the job adequately. This f3 square is the key one, the one where the white or the black bishop delivers mate. So here, yeah, bishop g2 sort of solves white's problems, but black is still winning by a lot. White never should have hung the d4 pawn, and black, I think, does a reasonably good job of breaking through all this. So, realistic, given optimal play, these moves are probably too aggressive, but I don't know. We didn't get optimal play in this situation, so with knight f3, I think there's threats on the king, and black's looking pretty sharp. Nothing really to do. Nothing really to do there. So knight f3, I guess. Cool. Yeah, interesting miniature. I don't know whether what to make out of that game exactly. Knight c3 is not the right move, and knight c6 is not the right move. E4 and hanging d4 causes white some problems. But here, I think, yeah, knight f3 is probably the optimal play. Yeah, interesting. All right, on to the next game. That was a very interesting miniature. Cool. Now we have Pravila's game and Atix's game. So let's take a look at those. Pravila's game is I think Pravila is playing white here, right? Or maybe he just sent this in on someone else's behalf. I'll just take it from white's perspective, unless he corrects me. All right. d4, knight f6, knight c3. Already not jazzed about this move. I think this move is basically, restrictive to the c pawn. Knight c3 is great, but played after c4. Otherwise, you're basically getting the c2 pawn stuck on this this square for a while. d5, e3, e6, knight f3, bishop b4. It's just close to equality. This knight on c3 is so inflexible that it probably leads to equality in most situations. Here you're already, like I said, at equality. E3 probably is, I don't know, not that great. Pawn takes, c4. And, yeah, some aggressive plays by white. So let's go through this more slowly. I want to say avoid knight c3. You need your c2 pawn for attacking. The opening lines here, knight c3 is a distant fourth. I would go with c4 here. c4 or knight c3. d5 is weak. This basically, I'd go with bishop g5, sure. But e3 also is restrictive. I think I'm seeing sort of a similar pattern, which is you need moves that really advance your development. With e3, basically, this white dark squared pawn bishop gets a lot worse. With knight f3, now you do have this idea of playing bishop d2, but this just isn't sort of the way that you wanted to play it. I would play c4 here. You want to challenge the center. I'm trying to think of an intuitive way to explain this, but basically, in the queen's pawn openings, you want to get control of the center by playing moves like d4, c4, d5, c5. This needs to come before the knight plays to c3. Here, white is basically crippled because he can't play c4 at any point. If he can't play c4 at any point, the situation is pretty bad for him. E3 also hems in the bishop on c1. Better idea here is like bishop f4 and then e3. But again, it's sort of tricky. I don't know how to intuitively explain it except for knowledge related to the queen's pawn game. c4 followed by knight c3 is the correct way to develop the knight. Bishop f4 followed by e3 is the correct way to develop the bishop. I want to come up with more general policies than that, but that's sort of how I would best explain this. c4, knight e5, and I think basically black's better. The errors here for white included the positional one that comes with locking in the bishop. Here, white is still fine. C4 I think is fine, but bishop to d3 doesn't really do anything. I would guess I would say pawn takes d5, and then bishop takes f1, rook takes f1, something like that would lead to an interesting position for white. But bishop d3 doesn't add anything to this attack, and it becomes vulnerable to pawn takes c4. Bishop d3 is refuted by pawn takes c4. This is just better for black, a better continuation for black. Here, in terms of defending the pawn, I don't think you really can super effectively. I think probably you just want to play pawn takes d5 or even c5 here. C5, bishop takes f1, c takes d5, bishop takes f1. Trade off the bishop, but I would advise against losing the pawn. I'm also wondering maybe you can play knight e5. I guess knight e5 is probably the most effective way to defend the c4 pawn. You need something to defend it. You definitely shouldn't lose it. So knight e5 is probably the best idea. And then I think this is pretty wild. The queen starts aggressively attacking you. Black is a little better, but not up by enough to justify such an aggressive attack. On queen f3, now it looks like knight g4 could be played, as could f5. D knight to f6 looks good. But f5, g3, knight to g5, and yeah, I think I would probably play queen takes a8, takes e8. The issue here is just that the knight to g4, knight to g5 is not a refutation of the g3 move. Here, basically the queen can take the rook, and the black queen will still be getting attacked. So, here the tactic, I think, most people would see it as a two-move tactic, is just queen takes a8, and then pawn takes h4, and here, white's basically showing rook up for not really any compensation. I guess white's king safety isn't fantastic, but you can just sort of ignore that, and overall, white's able to close out a win here. Interesting. So d4, knight f6, knight c3 isn't right. E3 probably could be improved too. E3 just sort of locks in the bishop. I think it's good to defend I think E3 in general is a good move, but I would get the bishop out first. The combination of knight c3, bishop f4 should be okay, but you are going to have some weaknesses to things like c5 going forward. Bishop f4 is probably how I would do this. Pawn takes, c4. Overall, black's looking good, and can play a reasonable game. But then black goes crazy with his attacking and tactics, and you can play g3, and then knight g5 just blunders a rook. So overall, interesting. It never really gets much closer than that towards the end. This ends up being pretty much a rough game for black. But I still think so in terms of improving this game, I guess I would say knight c3 is not correct. c4 or something that challenges the center is correct. Knight f3 could be playable here, but this is because this f2 pawn is not as necessary to maintaining a strong center in a queen's pawn game as knight to c3 is. So I'd play knight to f3 there. A3, pawn takes c3, c4, bishop a6, bishop d3. So in terms of moves that I think are not good, knight c3 is the first, and then bishop d3 seems inefficient here. Bishop d3 just doesn't solve any problems. Knight e5 provides effective defense for the c4 pawn. Bishop d3 just allows pawn takes c4 here, and basically this pawn is threatening this bishop on d3. Real problem. So it's inefficient because it's spending one tempo not solving a problem. Knight e5 would be better, knight d2 would be better, and even something straightforward and developing that loses the pawn, like bishop to b2 or bishop to d2, would provide an improvement for white. Anyways, with bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, queen g4, f5, g3, knight g5, just blunders a rook, and it's smooth sailing for white after that. Yeah, good play. Makes sense. I don't really know if there's that much, there's that much of an improvement for white to make here. It looks good. Solid. But so the two moves that I would work against here are basically the two moves that I would redo. Knight c3 is a general principle. That opening move I think is not good for your c pawns. Not terrible, but not good. And then here, bishop d3, c5, c takes d5 is a more efficient way to deal with this problem. Bishop d3 just doesn't add much. Gets hit by pawn takes c4, and white is good. Pawn takes c4, bishop e2, white is fine, or black is fine. So fine. I guess I would say your pawn's getting attacked. You don't want to lose the c4 pawn. Knight e5 is a more straightforward way to deal with it. Here, yeah, none of this seems to work particularly well. Yep. White just generally wins. It's a solid game. So on g3, knight g5 is a blunder. Queen takes a8, wins a rook. Game sort of ends. So, anyways, interesting game. I think white's pretty accurate after that. Maybe there's an inaccuracy or two, but black hangs his rook shortly enough after that I think the only two moves that I would correct for white are knight to c3, which traps the c2 pawn in, and bishop d3, which doesn't prevent pawn takes c4. You need like knight e5 to defend pawn takes c4. So overall, good, very good game, very interesting. And good tactic, good winning tactic, opening up the king side, or or basically using the tempo to play queen takes a8, while the g3 pawn is threatening the queen. Solid way to win, solid idea. And yeah, good stuff for white, to be honest. Just some slight inefficiencies, and I appreciate you sending the game. But with those, I think white could have attacked more efficiently. Still, what white did was great. I like this tactic at the end. Queening into checkmate is always awesome. Nicely done. Yeah, good stuff. Really interesting. Thank you very much for sending that, Privilo. Please keep sending games. Super interested in seeing kind of what you're thinking about and how to best how to best advise you in terms of improving. But yeah, overall, very interesting games. Thank you very much for participating in the stream. I really appreciate it. Thanks. Yeah, and then the last game is from A Takes. A Takes' game. A Takes is playing as black. We'll take a look at this here. Yeah, looks like the Italian game, bishop c4, bishop c5. This is an opening I know well. d3, knight f6, knight c3. And here I would play d6. I think d6 or castles. The engine is suggesting castles, but I would play d6 here. Basically, the idea of this opening is attacking the. Basically, it's both sides are attacking on the king side, and who wins is the one who can formulate the attack on the king side more effectively. I think the way to do this is d6, bishop g4. But overall, with d6, bishop g4, I think black should be able to get his shots in first. So I'd play d6, castles, bishop g4, and make white chase you with h3, g4. But overall, black I think has the better of it in this situation. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c5. Knight g4 seems overly aggressive to me. White can play d4. It does make d3 sort of inefficient. Bishop e3 can't be played, but I think white can just castle. And it does look awkward to castle here, with the knight already sort of attacking on g4. But I don't really think that white has kind of the maneuvering ability to get into, white has basically black. I don't think has the maneuvering ability to get in if white plays something like h3. Here d6, h3, h5. h5 makes sense. I think h5 defends the knight. It gives that standard rook over. But let's see. So knight takes xg4. Is this actually still good for black? I guess no. So I like h5 as a general concept, but I think it's not completely playable here. Here's the opening where I think you can play h5. I'm just going to go back and create a whole new game. The opening where h5 is played is this one. Bishop e5, a6, bishop b4, b5, bishop e3, bishop c5, castles, d6, knight c3, bishop g4, h3, h5. In this case, black can comfortably play, h takes g4, h takes g4, and then threats queen 2, h4. That seems like a better play for black here. Hey, what's up, Kiro? How are you? Nice to see you here. But yeah, so anyways, this is not a situation where h5 can be played. It's basically based on, this one is a place, but here's a situation where h5 can't be played. Once this bishop can defend the knight on g5, you basically can't play queen over to the. You can play knight to g5, and the queen can't play over to the h file anymore. With h5, okay, bishop to g5, f6, pawn takes, rook h5, and queen h4, and I think basically black is solid. There's not really much here, or I don't think there's much here for white. So the basic point of this game is this knight to this h5 move was not sound. White basically treats this as sound without ever actually calculating. Okay, knight takes, pawn takes, knight g5, and basically white is better. If he'd calculated this, he probably wouldn't have played. Bishop to g5. Instead, he gives you credit for an attack that you don't soundly have. You play f6, pawn takes, g5, and here like queen h4, and basically black is better. So it's kind of an interesting situation. White should have calculated this out. Should have seen the knight g5 move and not let this end up going through. With this in mind, I think that basically, I think that the pawn takes g4 becomes a lot clearer for white. F6 is better, or f6 basically makes black better here. They trade off the pieces, and black is good with a very open kingside, and then just white's totally busted. So interesting overall situation. White made the decision that h takes g4 was deadly, and then played it anyways, a move later. So, overall, just a lot of tactical steps here, and I don't know what you do. Black basically just sort of wins. In terms of improving black's game, I think your Italian game is fine. I don't think you need to play knight g4. This is just hyper-aggressive way to do things. I'd probably play d6. In terms of the opening book, d6 is the most common. I'd play d6. d6 is solid. Realistically, I don't think it impacts your ability to attack white's kingside too negatively. I think d6, bishop g4 on the next move, and you're in good shape. If h3 on the next move, h6, then g5, then g4. You do definitely want to attack aggressively on the king side, but this knight g4 I don't think is the most efficient structure to do it with. I think you play d6, get the bishop to g4, and you're in a good place. So d6 is an improvement that I see for black. This line, the lines relating to this I think is a better way to go. You'll have the ability, provided that the bishop may play to b5, he might, and stop knight to d4. But he might not, so then in that case you can play knight to d4 and try to double this f-pawns. This should be good for black, should overall be solid. So that's the line that I would recommend out of this opening. d6, castles, bishop g4, I like this better. Knight g4 is just sort of wild. You can play knight takes f2 here. It looks like it looks like the opening book does. I doubt the engine does though. Here, straightforward moves are what are evaluated by the engine as the best. There probably are some knight takes f2 sacrifices. I mean, this in the opening book looks, I don't know, probably just worse. Black basically loses 2 pieces to a rook, and that's sort of not the best idea. But yeah, here instead d6, and I think black's good. Sorry, I just read your comment, Kiro. I'm sorry that you're having those difficulties. That blows. Sorry that's happening to you. I hope you feel better. I didn't understand exactly what you were saying, but I just read that comment, so I really do hope you feel better. d6 here. Queen takes h5 and threats on the rook file. In terms of improving this game, I think the knight g4 threat in general is probably a little flimsy, but it worked out great for you. Yeah, queen takes h5. If white gives you credit for having a mating threat on pawn takes g4, then plays pawn takes g4 anyways, that tends to play out pretty badly. Yeah, sorry about that, Kiro. That is unfortunate. Yeah, so anyways, but yeah, that is rough, Kiro. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this stream. I hope I can provide some type of utility that makes you feel a bit better. Yep. Not too much in this game, to be completely honest. Looks like about 12 moves, and all of them sort of favor black. It's been a quiet night. We had a few that we were just really able to breeze through. I feel a little worried that I didn't give complete analysis to them. I guess we can go back to Abdu versus Goxel's game, just to square it up. So yeah, so this was a different game. We already went over this once, but I just wanted to give it its full time since we're way ahead of schedule. It's rare that we're actually way ahead of schedule. We got a bunch of miniatures in a row, so that was helpful, I think. Let's take this from black's perspective, because I'm pretty sure that black sent this game. Here I'd play c6 or knight f6. I think those are better strategic responses to knight c3. Knight c3 causes the c2 pawn to get locked in. And yeah, mate on move 15. I mean, how much can we improve this? But I don't know. I bet there's still a little bit of imprecision here. Getting this knight posted on d4 seems like a pretty smart idea. That definitely seems good. And yeah, knight to e4. I guess the best response I would figure is knight takes, maybe knight takes d4 here. Or maybe knight takes e4. But bishop g2 saves the king the most immediately. This puts pressure on the e4 pawn, and then basically white is solid. Overall, man, we breezed through tonight. These games were very short. Nope, not deterring anyone from playing short games, but this was sort of basically this this basically very quick these quick games lead to quick analysis, I guess. If you're mating on move 15, how inefficient could your moves have been? But yeah, overall, thank you very much for sending the game, and yeah, I really appreciate you guys spending the time on the stream. I hope this is helpful, and overall, yeah, thank you very much for sending the games. I think we're gonna wrap up early tonight, and feel free to send more. Thanks a lot. This is a miniature session. Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, thank you very much for sending it, and yeah, I appreciate you guys being here. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks. Bye.